It's the Brian Lehrer Show on WNYC. I'm Amina Serna, a producer for the Brian Lehrer Show, filling in for Brian today. Coming up on today's show, is President Trump planning to use the Venezuela playbook in Cuba? That's the question on the minds of foreign policy watchers, as the administration is showing signs that it plans to make a big move on Cuba. My guest will be Politico's Nahal Tusi, whose column from this week is titled, "Yes, Trump Might Really Attack Cuba." Plus, did you hear the news that the supposedly sustainable millennial chic clothing brand Everlane will be sold to Shein, the ultra-fast fashion behemoth? Kind of feels like the end of an era that started sometime in the 2010s when fashion companies at least tried to foster ethical consumption and sustainable practices. And we'll wrap today's show with, and I don't want to shock you, but some potentially life-changing news. New York-style bagels and pizza may be changing. Why? Lawmakers in Albany have passed a bill that would ban bromated flour, a widely used ingredient that many in the food industry think gives our bagels and pizza slices their unique New York texture. Turns out it's also potentially carcinogenic. Governor Hochul hasn't signed the bill into law yet, but we'll talk about the ingredient and the workarounds if it is indeed banned. But we begin with some exclusive reporting from our colleague David Brand, WNYC and Gothamist's housing reporter. David's latest is on Mayor Zohran Mamdani's first neighborhood-level rezoning initiative, dubbed the South of Prospect Plan. It targets the commercial corridors of Coney Island Avenue and McDonald Avenue in Brooklyn for denser housing development. The logic is in choosing this location. It seems to be that it's a transit hub that heads into Manhattan with an eye towards the future Interborough Express light rail. The announcement, paired with a North Bronx rezoning along White Plains Road, are the first concrete signals of how this administration will use neighborhood-level zoning power. And it comes as the city contends with what David describes as, quote, a dire housing shortage that has led to record-high rents and driven tens of thousands of residents out of the 5 boroughs. David Brand joins us now. Hi, David. Welcome back to the show.
Hey, Amina. Thanks for having me.
So you broke the story that the Mamdani administration is launching its first neighborhood-level housing plan. So walk us through it. What exactly is the South of Prospect Plan?
That's right. The Mamdani administration wants to rezone a big swath of, you could say that's Kensington for sure, probably parts of Flatbush, Midwood, Borough Park for more residential, for housing, for more residential density. Like right now, especially along Coney Island Avenue, which they're targeting, and McDonald Avenue, south of the park there. It's pretty low-rise residential, 2-3-story homes and apartment buildings, auto body shops, single-story businesses. But this is kind of prime real estate from a planner's perspective and from a housing perspective because it is very well served by multiple subway lines. You have the B, the F, the Q, the G all running there. It's close to the park. Short trip to Manhattan. And what the administration is pointing out is that we may get the new IBX, Interborough Express light rail, installed about 1.5 miles south of the park. So that's only going to make it even more transit rich.
This administration has been in office for about 5-ish months now and has talked a lot about housing already. So how is this announcement different from the other housing moves we've seen so far?
Well, this is the first time the Mamdani administration is really spearheading a neighborhood-level rezoning plan. So you think back to the Adams administration, they put forth a number of rezoning plans for places like Midtown South to turn that piece of Manhattan, which is right now zoned for mostly commercial and manufacturing, into a new residential neighborhood, similar to what we saw with the financial district 20-some years ago under Mayor Bloomberg. And so every administration has these neighborhood plans, and this is Mamdani's first one. He's also picking up another one that the Adams administration started, and that's for a big section of the northern Bronx, covering Allerton, Wakefield, right up to the Mount Vernon border.
Listeners, if you live in the neighborhood south of Prospect Park, as David was just mentioning, that's Kensington, Flatbush, Midwood, Borough Park, anywhere along Coney Island Avenue or McDonald Avenue. What do you want to see on your block? What kind of changes do you want to see? Do you see opportunities where more housing can be built, and where? Or maybe you have some concerns about your neighborhoods being targeted for rezoning. What are you afraid of losing? Give us a call now at 212-433-WNYC. That's 212-433-9692. You can also text that number. David, the administration is framing this as a transit-oriented development. You kind of were starting to talk us through some of the options there, but why do they think that this area is currently a good option?
Well, it has all of these subway lines and subway stops. It could be near the future site of that IBX above-ground train line running from Brooklyn to Queens. Right now, it already connects to Long Island City via the G train, connects to Manhattan through multiple lines, the B, the Q, the F. It's close to the park. Many bus lines there. And the goal in cities in particular is to build more housing near public transportation because people flock there because they need to get to work, often in Manhattan, more people working in parts of Brooklyn or in Queens. So would be well served by subway system and bus lines and that light rail system. You mentioned you put out the call to callers. I really do want to hear from a lot of people on this because it's so new. And the Mamdani administration hasn't really put forth any specifics aside from they want to target McDonald Avenue, Coney Island Avenue. There's been some spot rezonings, like one-off. We want to build a large apartment complex on Coney Island Avenue. We need city council approval for that. And people have been talking about that area for a long time in need of some type of residential rezoning to build more housing there. And so I am curious to hear what people have to say and what they want and what their experience with this is going to be because it is so new.
I'll give him the number again, 212-433-WNYC. That's 212-433-9692. You can call or text. You were just talking about the IBX, that's the Interborough Express, the light rail line that hasn't been built yet. It would connect Brooklyn to Queens without having to go through Manhattan. This is probably a question we can ask our transit reporter, Stephen Nesson, next time he comes on. But we've been talking about the light rail for a really long time on this program. So is it still happening? And how central is the IBX to this whole rezoning plan?
Well, it seems to be moving ahead. But you're right. I mean, with these large-scale projects, you never really know. But there is a lot of planning in place. They have the line. They have the right-of-ways. They have the decommissioned train tracks that they would be using for some of these for some of the sections of this light rail. It does seem it's moving in that direction. It has a lot of political support. But it's not, I guess, necessary for this plan to work, according to the Department of City Planning. I was talking to the planning director, Sadia Sherman, the other day about this plan, and she was saying, it's already such a transit-rich area, and that the current zoning rules don't allow it to live up to its potential, I think was the way she described it, because there's so much opportunity for housing that can't be built legally right now.
Let's take a call. Here is Reed in Kensington. Hi, Reed. You're on WNYC.
Hi, yes. And excited about the housing, but really excited about Coney Island Ave being restructured to be less of an industrial area. In the summer, it's covered in illegally parked, wrecked cars from all the mechanic shops. I use the shops around there to a certain extent, but I really want that to be a more pedestrianized area, a more residential area, and less like this giant scar that cuts the neighborhood into huge two parts and running all the way down that whole place. So I'm very excited for this. I hope it goes through.
Reed, thank you so much for your call. David, describe this area that's being targeted for rezoning for us.
Well, like what Reed said, there are a lot of automotive shops there. It kind of reminds me of Atlantic Avenue, where the city did a rezoning a couple years ago under the Adams administration because, that's such a major thoroughfare in Brooklyn. But it's a lot of industrial, a lot of manufacturing, a lot of auto body shops, a lot of businesses that were closed. But couldn't really build housing there. And so they came up with this plan with a lot of buy-in from the local council members, Crystal Hudson, Chio Say, a lot of community engagement to rezone that stretch of Atlantic Avenue and surrounding blocks for more housing. And a portion of that would be affordable housing. And so I kind of think of that one when I think of what's going on at Coney Island Ave. Another one, Jerome Avenue in the Bronx under the de Blasio administration, they rezoned. That was, I think, a little more controversial because the surrounding neighborhood had median income that was a lot lower than even the affordable housing that was getting built in that neighborhood. So I think this is different because this is more of a middle class area. I think the median incomes are a little higher than we saw in the Bronx with that Jerome Avenue rezoning. But there was a lot of automotive shops that were displaced or at risk there, and city had to try to find some new places or support for some of those businesses.
And what about Coney Island Ave? My impression is that it's sort of that area itself is a pretty wide road, many dangerous intersections for crossing. I mean, is it even walkable? Should there be more residential units built there?
Well, what happens with these neighborhood level rezonings is they come with the housing, but they also come with usually a lot of other pledges, not always fulfilled, but often street redesigns, public spaces, park, commercial areas. So I think that's going to come up a lot in this planning process that the city just kicked off. They just launched a survey, I think, on Wednesday for members of the surrounding neighborhoods to submit their perspective and their ideas for what a neighborhood redevelopment could look like. And I bet a lot of people are going to be talking about those street redesigns.
Here is a caller on a potential street redesign. Zach in Brooklyn. You're on WNYC. Hi, Zach.
Hey, everyone. Thanks for having me. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you loud and clear.
Yeah, just to say, bottom of Kensington, I think they put up a sign recently, like Little Bangladesh. I didn't mention this to the screener, but there's a huge, community of folks at the Church Avenue sort of junction where there's heavy, two-wheel transit, lots of bikers, lots of delivery guys. I'm not one of them, but I go all over the city for a job with the city and have an e-bike and would love to see like a big double-wide cycling on McDonald, really all the way down to the beach if we could. And I think it fits in with just this idea of street redesigns you're mentioning and just adding density and more housing over there. We need it. I'm in like an unofficial ADU myself. And the last thing I'll mention is just like from a politics perspective, I like the idea that the administration is focused on policy, like connecting housing and transit hubs from like a smart, just technocratic, but really like community-based policy perspective instead of like the prior administration's Manhattan focus. And I wonder what it has to do with other politics, like city council, folks who are over there who might be aligned with the administration. I think that's Shahana Hanif's area. I voted for her. Sorry, I gotta go. Have a good one though. Thank you,
Zach. Thanks so much for your call. David, a couple of things coming up there in Zach's call. The diversity of the neighborhood, his sort of desire to have a nice bike lane that goes all the way down to the beach. Where do you want to weigh in?
Well, I guess for a lot of transit going on, too. It sounded like alternate side of the street parking coming for Zach over there, maybe. But no, I think that's a great point. There are a lot of people who rely on, he said, two-wheel transport, e-bikes, bicycles in that area. Mm-hmm. It is a direct line from McDonald Ave down to Coney Island. So I think a lot of people will be excited for more bike access down to the beach there, as you mentioned. But I think that's a great point. And I think, it's kind of what we had just talked about potential street redesigns and that being part of a neighborhood rezoning. It's not just about we're going to dump a lot of housing in this neighborhood. It's also tends to be a more kind of thoughtful approach to development overall. And again, we're going to see how that plays out because it's really early stages.
We're getting some pushback to this rezoning plan. Here's one via text. A listener writes, Kensington is a very specific type of neighborhood. It's almost like a small town. What limits will be put into place to maintain the character of the area? The rezoning in areas like Greenpoint and Long Island City completely change the areas that are super expensive, overcrowded, with a dearth of resources. So any sort of limits? Is anyone talking about maintaining the character of the area or anything like that?
Well, it's right that those rezonings did totally transform those areas. I would say those were different because there was a waterfront dominated by manufacturing that was totally changed about 20 years ago under the Bloomberg administration to allow for high-rise residential development. And we've seen the highest concentration of new housing development in the city has been in those areas, Williamsburg, Greenpoint, Long Island City, and obviously there's a brand new skyline over the past 2 decades there. I think this would be different, and they tend to call this contextual rezoning, where along the larger streets, McDonald, Coney Island Ave, they'll zone for higher density, taller buildings, bigger buildings, and then on the side streets or intersecting streets tends to be a little lower, fit more of that quote neighborhood character, maybe somewhat higher. What's interesting here is that voters did approve several ballot measures in November that already would allow for larger zoning than the current rules that are in place, like slightly higher than is currently allowed under zoning, or bonuses for developers who include more affordable housing than the rules require in their building. So there's already a trend toward slightly larger development that I think we would see even more of from this kind of rezoning.
And here's another critique from Monique in Tarrytown. Hi, Monique. You're on WNYC.
Hi. I'm an old architect and worked in planning for City of Chicago, and some kind of cautionary terms about the orchestration of this sort of development. You have to be careful of gentrification and scale and sunlight and, making mixed use of zoning. And I would really encourage looking at like owner-occupied rentals and things like courtyard buildings that are really strong in Chicago that really help contribute to not only a community feel, but also for maintenance. Because if you want, you want to have ownership. Because when you defer a lot of the maintenance to, let's say, subsidized housing to government agency, there's not the same kind of connection than when you actually own it and you live in it. So those are just some thoughts. Chicago's got some great courtyard buildings, the scale of buildings, and I've always felt that people should have access to the water and the sites and put the tall buildings behind, not in front. Thank you.
Monique, thank you so much. David, I know that this is an ongoing process that has just started, so maybe you want to talk about how we're at the sort of public input stage of this rezoning project?
Yeah, so the city just initiated this. As I've said, they just launched this new survey for residents of the areas to weigh in on what they want to see from a redevelopment, whether that's housing, new kind of commercial areas, street redesign, parks, et cetera, though this is very close to Prospect Park. Also to Greenwood Cemetery and Parade Ground, so it's pretty prime for public space. One thing I think people might want to see, and somebody brought up the Greenpoint Williamsburg rezoning earlier, the G train is still so small. Despite so many people moving into the neighborhood, it's still the shortest train. You're standing on the platform and you are on your phone, you look up and, oh, right, the train is 100 yards away. I have to run for it now because it's a shorter car than the platform allows. And the G train runs through this area too. So if they're going to rezone here, maybe we could finally get a longer G train.
And to Monique's point about gentrification, and this has come up in a lot of texts, this is one of the most diverse parts of Brooklyn. It's home to Little Bangladesh, Little Pakistan, significant Orthodox Jewish communities, and many others. So how is the city planning to engage all those communities in the planning process?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, it's a very diverse area, as you mentioned. It's kind of a microcosm of New York City writ large, just in these, square block area south of the park. So probably going to need a lot of translation services, meeting people where they're at in community centers or kind of community hubs for the various diverse communities in that area. So I think that's going to be a big part of their community engagement that they really have to plan for.
We're going to take a quick break. It's the Brian Lair Show on WNYC. I'm Amina Serna, filling in for Brian today. David Brand is our housing reporter for WNYC and Gothamist, and we're talking about the sweeping housing plan for blocks south of Brooklyn's Prospect Park. More of your calls after this break. It's the Brian Lair Show on WNYC. I'm Amina Serna, filling in for Brian today. We're joined by David Brand, housing reporter for WNYC and Gothamist, on his latest exclusive scoop up now on Gothamist, titled Mamdani Eyes Sweeping Housing Plan for Block South of Brooklyn's Prospect Park. And let's take a call. Here is Helen in Midwood. Hi, Helen. You're on WNYC.
Hi. Actually, did you say I was in Midwood? No. I'm in South Midwood. Midwood
South
is so
Midwood.
large. South Midwood is east of West Midwood. Don't ask. It's a huge neighborhood. Anyway, I grew up in a house that my parents were able to buy because the Q line, the Brighton Beach, what used to be the Brighton Beach line, extended itself far enough south so that houses could be built for people to live in and then go to work in Manhattan. So it was the whole neighborhood, which was Gravesend, essentially, and other names, came into existence because of the subway. And Coney Island Avenue, and when my childhood and young adulthood, was this concrete desert of auto repair shops and antique stores. Hardly any trees along it. It was a really, in contrast to Ocean Parkway and even Ocean Avenue, which was a far more beautiful residential street going all the way down to the ocean. So as I'm listening to this, yes, build houses, but make sure, this woman who just called before, keep it in proportion, keep it in context. Make sure that there are trees, make sure that there are courtyards, make sure that the houses don't go too high. This is very important to maintain and create neighborhoods that people want to live in, and without turning them into these terrible block, very, very tall. They look like prisons most of the time when you start building for people who have low income. I'm not sure what housing is being thought of for, what income level, but it should be mixed. Mm-hmm. I think it's really, really important to do this in order to improve the situation of where they're being built and to encourage people to want to live there and to be able to live there. That's my comment.
Interesting points from Helen in South Midwood. David, I mean, there's no concept map yet and no formal zoning proposal. You report that that's at least a year away. But to Helen's point there, I mean, do we know anything about sort of income brackets or who's being sort of targeted for this type of housing?
Well, Helen has some great views and some great historical perspective right up to the current day. So I think, Helen, you got to go to this, it's this survey that the city planning department just put out called Community Priorities for the Neighborhoods South of Prospect Park. And if you go to my story on Gothamist.com, I link to the survey. You should fill that out and share some of those opinions as it helps shape this plan, I think. So as for affordability levels, so every time there's a rezoning that requires city approval, there are rules that a quarter of the new apartments created in buildings that result from that rezoning have to have incomes capped for low and middle income renters. And there's some pretty specific rules. There's options that developers can choose. But basically, they have to reserve a quarter of the new apartments for people earning less than the median income. We don't know exactly what those are. There's often a lot of negotiation around that. Council members demand more affordability. A lot of people in neighborhoods want more affordability. And Mayor Mamdani, his campaign pledge was to create 200,000 affordable housing units during his time as mayor. So I'm I imagine he would focus on that as well, because a big neighborhood plan like this is an opportunity to build a lot of affordable housing with city subsidy and city financing.
This area overlaps with districts represented by council members Shahana Hanif, Rita Joseph, Farah Lewis, and Simcha Felder. And they represent kind of a wide political spectrum. Where's the political support coming from right now?
Well, all four of them have been positive about this. They, after I reported, the city did release a press release that had supportive quotes from all four of them. I specifically spoke to Shahana Hanif and Rita Joseph, two of the council members, and they said they're excited about this. Hanif said, she grew up in Kensington. She knows the need for more affordable housing, take some of the pressure off of existing residents there by adding more housing, and also give more people opportunity to move into the area. And likewise with Councilmember Joseph, she represents a section of that area too, and said we need to build more housing before the IBX comes in, assuming that it's built, because there's going to be even more pressure there, people moving in, because it will be this new transit line. And so we need to get ahead of that as a city and build more housing so there's options, so there's not so much competition for the existing housing and potential for displacement of people who don't have tenant protections living there, and rents could go up because it becomes more desirable.
Let's take another call. Here is Nick in Brooklyn. Hi, Nick. You're on WNYC.
Hi. I read your article, and I was really glad it was out there. Although for me, it was mostly kind of chilling. For me and for everybody in my neighborhood here in Prospect Lefferts Gardens, our experience of developers is that generally we find them to be criminals. And they ignore stop orders, they ignore the rules of building, and you can just walk up and down the neighborhood and just see new buildings that have come up that are built completely illegally. In fact, one of them had a problem where somebody fell through the floor when they drilled into the sidewalk. They drilled into somebody's basement because they built a basement under the sidewalk without telling anybody. Or they did tell people, but our trust in the DOB is completely eroded. We, as a block association, have been fighting these developers for decades. I've been here for over 16 years. And most of the people here are like that last caller. They've been here for generations in single-family owned houses. So right now they're building a 9-story building right around the corner, which is it's not zoned for that, but they don't seem to care, and neither does the DOB.
Nick?
It's just, yeah.
Thank you so much for your call. Let me get a response for you there. David, what about the sort of developer accountability? Is that part of any discussions that you were reporting on?
I hadn't heard some of that about illegal construction in Prospect Lefferts Gardens, so would be definitely interested in finding more about that, especially that illegal basement potentially under a sidewalk. That's really interesting to hear about. I mean, there's a lot of valid criticisms of developers and sometimes the way certain developers go about business or try to cut corners or, shoddy construction. And then there's often complaints when things change. If a big building goes up in an area that's traditionally lower rise, that's going to elicit a lot of responses, whether that's constructed illegally, as Nick said, or just a change to the cityscape. I mean, that kind of stuff always elicits strong reactions. And so that's one of the challenges for these rezoning plans is confronting the opinions of people who have been living in the neighborhood for a long time.
We have one such caller that's kind of reflecting a lot of that change in cityscape that you were just mentioning. Here is Richard in Miller Place on Long Island. Hi, Richard, you're on WNYC.
Hi, thanks for taking my call. I lived in that neighborhood for the first 31 years of my life on Ocean Parkway between O and P, so I'm very familiar with it. But I have a related question about housing. I live on Long Island now, and I frequent the city. I mostly to go to theater and museums, and to Brooklyn too. And every time I go on the Williamsburg Bridge or the Manhattan Bridge, however I go wherever I'm going, and every time I go, there seems to be 10 new high-rises on either side of the highway. So I've been curious as to why is there a housing need when all these houses that didn't exist 10 or 15 years ago block out the sun on the highways now?
Richard?
Where were all the people before if these houses...
didn't exist. Yeah, that makes sense. Richard, thank you so much for your call. David?
Well, that's kind of the classic question, Richard, as you hear often, and I've thought this myself. You see so much new development, especially in Brooklyn and Queens, close to the waterfront, happening in Jamaica, Queens, near the train station there. I totally hear that. I think what a lot of housing experts and people in the city would say is there still isn't enough. Like it's a confirmation bias or something. It looks like there's so much development, but even though the construction is up, development is up, it's still not enough to meet the need. And the city has, according to the most recent housing survey, a 1.4% apartment vacancy rate. For apartments priced below $2,400 a month, that vacancy rate was below 1%. I've talked to people who say, that was conducted in 2023. People say might have gotten worse since then. And you could see it in the bidding wars for apartments and in the just how few listings there are on listing sites for new apartments and how many people are being forced to leave New York City because they're middle income, low income, and they can't afford to rent and let alone buy. And so though there is definitely more construction, the Real Estate Board of New York just put out a report yesterday, a quarterly report for first quarter of 2026, showing that construction is actually up about 75% year over year, so compared to the same time period last year. And yet it's still not enough to meet the need for new housing for a growing city.
Let's take another call. Here's Jenny in Jackson Heights. Hi, Jenny. You're on WNYC.
Hi. I think one thing that's really being overlooked here is that the levels of affordability that Mr. Brand is referring to, which is called MIH, essentially those are the only tools to ensure affordability. It's not affordable enough. So the 25% of units that are deemed affordable are shockingly expensive. Some of them are more expensive than the surrounding market rates. So an MIH as a tool is simply inadequate. This is going to cause more displacement. There are lots of people of color, immigrants, poor people living in this neighborhood. Many of them live in single-family homes, in apartments. Pardon me, I swallowed my coffee wrong here. Those people are very, very vulnerable to displacement because they don't live in rent-stabilized apartments. The rents go up whenever luxury units come into a neighborhood. I'm very disappointed in my mayor, for continuing down this road, which is a road toward gentrification and displacement. That's my fear.
Jenny, thank you so much for your call. And just for the listeners, I'll note that Jenny's referring to mandatory inclusionary housing there, MIH, and it's a zoning tool that requires developers to designate like a specific percentage, around 20%, she said 25% there, of newly built housing into like permanently affordable, low to moderate income households. But yeah, David, what were you hearing in Jenny's call there?
Well, Jenny's right. I mean, a lot of what's considered affordable housing under those mandatory inclusionary housing rules is still way too expensive for a lot of New Yorkers. And I mentioned earlier, kind of talking about rezonings of the past that this reminded me of. And I was talking about that Jerome Avenue in the Bronx rezoning from about a decade ago. That was a huge critique there. Also in East New York, where there was a big rezoning plan, that a lot of the new affordable housing was actually higher than people were typically paying in kind of market rate apartments in those areas. And so maybe we need more deeply affordable, more city subsidies, city financing for housing tailored to the lowest income New Yorkers. I think that's something that is going to come up a lot in this rezoning plan, especially the first new neighborhood level plan for this administration.
We're getting several texts that are saying kind of have similar thoughts. Here's one. Cue the NIMBYism. These last few calls are the same usual thinking that has the city in a state of crisis with home prices. We need housing, people. And another person writes, I live and work on the border of PLG and work as a public librarian in Flatbush. I get the caller's concerns about developers, but we desperately need more affordable housing and more density. So, David, my question to you is the mayor has pledged 200,000 new affordable units over 10 years at a cost of $100 billion. How does a plan like south of Prospect connect to that larger goal? And I don't know, are housing experts saying that this timeline is realistic?
It's an ambitious plan, I think. And that was what he said on the campaign trail, 200,000 affordable units. But you can't get to large volumes of affordable housing without these types of sweeping neighborhood level rezoning plans, because then every new building that's built as part of that has to include a certain number of affordable units through, as you mentioned, the mandatory inclusionary housing rules. So you really can't even approach tens of thousands, he said, 200,000 affordable units without pretty major rezoning plans for entire neighborhoods or sections of the city.
This Brooklyn plan was announced alongside a North Bronx rezoning along White Plains Road that's actually much further along in the process. What can the Bronx process tell us about how the Brooklyn one might unfold?
So this Bronx process began about a year ago. Similarly, that was under the Adams administration with the support of two local council members, Councilman Kevin Riley and Councilman Eric Dinowitz. They started a community engagement process, online surveys, public meetings to hear from residents. Kind of similarly to Coney Island Avenue, there's a lot of low-rise commercial businesses along White Plains Road in the northern section of the Bronx. Kind of low-rise residential, but there is the 2 and 5 tracks are running right through the middle of that road, so there's a lot of transit access there as well. And so the plan there is to increase housing density, allow more people to move into that area closer to the trains. This would cover most of the neighborhoods, Allerton, Wakefield, right up to the Mount Vernon border. So that's been going on for about a year. So we're going to see an actual plan, an actual proposal for what blocks would be covered and what the housing density allowed on those areas would be in coming months. That'll be done a lot sooner in this Brooklyn plan.
David, we have a caller who says he works for a research group that researches rezoning. Sean at City College of New York. Hi, you're on WNYC.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Yes. So I really appreciate the conversation. One of the things that the center has been focused on, and that's the JMAX Bond Center for Urban Futures, we've been working with the city's own data, particularly environmental impact studies, and something that David mentioned, really working on a community set of priorities, and then matching that with the data to really kind of evaluate if a new proposal, whether it be rezoning or a particular housing development, is equitable or not. Really focusing in on priorities and making those priorities connect to some historical information and maybe rebuild the trust of the communities that are being targeted and foster a kind of mature and informed conversation and maybe even negotiation when it comes to what the developers are seeking.
Sean, thank you so much for your call. David, I mean, there is the public input period now, but an interesting, building a community trust to use the city's own data to inform these decisions is pretty interesting proposal from Sean there.
Yeah, it sounds like a great tool that Sean and his team are working on to put some data behind what community members are asking for or demanding.
And we are getting, as we run out of time here, David, we are getting a couple of texts that think that the link to the survey went by a little bit too quickly. So how can they find it on your piece?
Oh, so yes, go to Gothamist.com. You can look up my story. It is titled Mamdani Eyes. Sorry, I'm bringing it up right now. Mamdani Eyes Sweeping Housing Plan for Blocks South of Brooklyn's Prospect Park. And in the third paragraph, I link to the neighborhood survey released Wednesday. You know, it's available on the city website. I think the URL is like a little too complicated to get to, but you can check it out on that story.
Well, you know what? We're also going to post it because we're getting so much demand. So we're going to link to the survey on the Brian Lair Show segment page for this interview. People can find that once it's posted around noon today. And one last question, David. You had expressed some interest in one caller's reporting on some developer mayhem happening in his neighborhood, and a couple of other people are asking how they can get in touch with you for tips and story ideas. Do you want to shout out?
Yes, that's awesome. Thank you. Please do get in touch. I get so many of my best tips and information from people who listen whenever I'm on the show. So you can email me at dbrand, BRAND, at WNYC.org. So that's my name, D for David, and last name, Brand, like brand new shoes, at WNYC.org.
David Brand is housing reporter for WNYC and Gothamist. He has been talking to us about his latest exclusive scoop up now on Gothamist titled Mamdani Eyes Sweeping Housing Plan for Blocks South of Brooklyn's Prospect Park. Thanks so much for coming on today, David.
Thanks a lot, Amina, and thanks to all the callers.
WNYC's journalism and storytelling is heard by millions of passionate listeners. Sponsors of our programming gain our listeners' attention and their respect. Learn about how your organization can support WNYC and WNYC Studios at sponsorship.wnyc.org.